really bad. And also that green dress. Has anyone run into this green fabric before that does not show up at all? No one even knows what I'm talking about? This is like a thing that people have been talking about for a while, that they'd go to this professional, this photo shoot, everybody's got this new green thing they're trying to sell, and it comes up gray. Just gray every single time. There's nothing they can do about it. They're checking all the settings, they're reprocessing the film, whatever that we're doing. It's because, look at that, it's very, very specific frequency. So if your camera senses a little bit off here, a little, right here, and right here, or your film, which is where, a lot of people ran into this, it sees them all as the same because it picked up some here, and maybe a little less blue. So it ends up as a slightly warm gray, but there's no green at all. So understanding how to white balance will really make some big differences in how it perceives color.
What, on the skin tone and the gray card that's flat across the top, what was the light source that...
These are all independent of any kind of light.
Okay, so this is
if you put energy onto this, that's how much it bounces back. So if we bounce this light off of it, we would get a completely different effect than if we bounce that light off of it. And that's why when we bounce it off this, we do get two different effects, and that's how white balance can tell how to compensate for the two.
How do they come up with those graphs?
These are spectral graphs that you measure with a spectrophotometer. It has a known light source that it can then take out of the equation when it builds the graph.
Oh, okay.
So this graph right here, under this skin tone under one light will look different than it will under another light to your eye. And we need to have a reference, which is why we have this gray. If you notice, this is not completely flat though. Ideally, this would be a completely flat line without a little gap here and without it kind of going down a little bit. That's the unique things about each one of these gray cards, is some of them are more perfect than others. None of them are perfect though. They almost all have this little gap down here. But the top part being flat is kind of the key, because there's not there's no, the key blue frequency for your camera is further up, so it's not a huge issue that that's not there. All right, so we've white balanced. We've gotten a gray card that we know is gray. And you can look up specs on these and find out what that little gray graph is and how flat it is. If you don't have that information for your gray card and you can't get somebody to measure it, you need to know how neutral it is. Don't just say, it's gray. Okay, that's kind of okay, but it's if it's off by a little bit, it's gonna tint everything blue or tilt everything to one direction or the other, depending on how flat that is.
And you're going to tell us how to measure how gray balanced that card is. How do we determine that?
The manufacturers should publish this information, and like I said, or if you have access to a spectrophotometer, you can take a measurement directly on it. The manufacturer would have just taken a measurement with a spectrophotometer. But the key thing to keep in mind is that it needs to not just be neutral, it needs to be what's called spectrally neutral. And because this is neutral, at least to a certain color temperature. It's only neutral because there's a huge amount here, but there's hardly any there. So if you average it all out, it's kind of flat like this is, flat-ish. But spectrally neutral means that at any given frequency, it's outputting about the same amount that it received. And the key thing about that is that if it's only averaging, if it's only flat on average, and you end up with a huge dip down here or gap in what it reflects that happens to line up with a huge spike up here, you're not going to compensate for something that needs compensating for. A lot more information than you really need, but it needs to reflect back what it gets. That's the whole point in the white balancing. It's a reference, so it knows, oh, that's white, and I saw a lot more red and a lot less blue, and I know how to then basically put a curve that goes the exact opposite direction. So it now perceives things flat again. So instead of perceiving things at a off kilter where it sees a lot more red, it says, oh, okay, there's a lot more red in this light. I need to take a lot of red out. Does that make sense?
Michael, are you going to talk about maybe some selective ideas for how one would select a gray card, other than just advice from a buddy or a peer, how to measure what gray they want, or is that not what you're going to
take this information basically and look at the specs online, and then I will kind of talk about each of them and what they do. But the idea is that honestly, I don't care whose card you buy. I'm not selling a product. I'm not promoting a product. I'm just saying if you want to get good gray balance, it needs to be neutral. I don't care if you found it on the ground and it's neutral. If you can prove to me that it's neutral, it'll work for white balance. The more reflective it is, the better, because you get more noise in a dark gray than you would in a light gray that could throw things off a little bit, that kind of thing. But I mean, there's products up here that serve this function, and there's kind of some creative things you can do with them too, that like the Color Checker Passport that I'll get into when we get to that. Okay, so we have a good white balance. Like I said, you've got something neutral. You've taken a picture of it. That's pretty much it. You've decided what light you're going to take a picture with, and that's going to be the neutral light now. When you shoot the target, things get a little bit more interesting. It needs to be lit evenly. That not only evenly as far as intensity goes, there's no shadows on it, or there's not a large, brighter area or darker area, but you also don't have any color changes over the target. That's a key thing, because if you have some mixed light and you don't know it, you end up with a bluer side and a yellower side to your target. And yeah, your white balance is in the middle, and it's fixed the middle, but all the colors on one side, it's going to make them less yellow, and the other side's going to make them less blue, because you had that inconsistency in light. Now, if you're shooting something really small like this, it's a lot easier to get them consistent than if you're trying to shoot something like this. And again, this is like 24 colors on this thing. We've got like 500 here. So if you have a small shift here, it could really screw things up. So one way or another, you need to get it lit evenly, and you need to get it the same color throughout. You need to not have any reflections, both in the target, and what I mean is that when you look at it, you don't see yourself or see the thing behind you, but also reflections from other objects. If I set this on the table here, I'm getting a nice wood color kind of wash throughout this whole thing. That's not going to work, because it's going to try and it's going to be more down here towards the table and less up here. So you need to have no reflections, or try not to have any. Your exposure needs to be correct, okay? And this is the biggest variable in doing this whole thing. And I can only say that having tested this hundreds and, I don't even know, thousands of times, each piece of software wants a kind of different exposure. And so correct exposure really is a hard thing to communicate. But it definitely needs to not have blown out highlights, and it definitely needs to have a good shadow. And then from there, if you are creating a camera profile with your Color Checker Passport here, try it multiple times at slightly different exposures, because it'll make a difference at how contrasty, how bright your colors are, how it changes the whole take on it. Because everything else, you can figure out a way to eliminate as a variable. But the exposure is a hard, it makes a big difference. Let's put it that way. All right, so if you're going to be lighting this, any one of these targets for calibrating or profiling your camera, there's three main options you've got. You've got a single flash with a large softbox. The Colorize manufacturer recommends this method. I have found that it works. You don't have any issues with color balance, because you only have one kind of light. It's going to be the same kind throughout your entire target. But getting the light even throughout the entire target is incredibly challenging and